The rain started the same way it always did on Kepler 9 sideways, like the sky had given up on falling gracefully. Commander Mara Voss pressed her palm flat against the cold porthole glass and watched the storm chew through the relay towers along the ridge, tearing orange sparks out of the alloy struts and swallowing them before they hit the ground. Somewhere in the facility below, her daughter's last recorded voice still lived on a server. She had stopped believing in much. She had not stopped believing in that. She turned from the window and looked at the room. It had been a year. She could tell because of the dust. The soft gray layer of it on the equipment she hadn't touched since the incident. On the second chair at the workstation. On the small framed photograph sitting at the edge of her desk. She didn't look at the photograph yet. She did that last. Always last. Like a ritual she'd inherited from someone braver than she'd managed to feel in a while. The Vethkar had not come back. That surprised people. Back at Central Command. It surprised the brass who'd written off Kepler 9 outpost as a total loss after the incident. It surprised the xenodiplomacy teams who'd spent 18 months building predictive contact models that all pointed to a second strike within 6 months. It surprised everyone except Mara, because Mara had been there when the Vethkar commander, if that was the right word for whatever stood at the front of a Vethkar incursion party, had looked at her across the wreckage of the lower deck and simply stopped, treated, not regrouped, stopped. It had looked at her the way you look at something you cannot classify, something that does not fit the categories your entire evolutionary history has prepared you for. There was no aggression in the stop, no fear, no mercy either. None of the recognizable emotional furniture that might have made it legible. Just an absolute suspension of forward motion, and then the sound it made. Lower than language, older, something that moved through the smoke and the structural groan of the burning corridor, like a frequency she had felt in her back teeth. And then it had turned, and its unit had followed it, and they had left. Left her alone in the smoke with her grief and her tools, and the data core she'd pulled from the rubble with her own burned hands. She had been trying to understand why ever since. Her name had been Lena, 7 years old. Bright enough to make your chest hurt with the specific brightness of a child who asks questions that the adults in the room can't answer, who watches your face while you scramble for something that sounds true, who finds that gap and files it away, like a mechanic cataloging a part she'll need later. She'd been running a diagnostic loop on the backup generator when the first Vethkar drop pod punched through the roof of the lower facility. The explosion had been instantaneous. The thermal assessment report Mara had read 3 times said she would not have experienced pain. Mara had read it a 4th time and decided she didn't know how to interpret that sentence and stopped reading. She had been 3 corridors away. By the time she reached the lower deck, the structure was fully compromised. And 2 of the fire suppression engineers had tried to pull her back, and she had gone through them with the particular single-mindedness of someone who has already performed the calculation and is no longer interested in alternatives. She had found almost nothing. Almost. The corridor had been a furnace. The environmental suit she'd grabbed on the run from her quarters. A maintenance suit, not rated for this. Not rated for the structural fragments still falling, or the secondary burn patches, where the drop pod's propellant had soaked into the composite walls and was still going. She had moved through it in the specific state that she had read about in field medicine texts and never expected to experience herself. It's the state where the body's threat assessment machinery trips a circuit and the volume on everything that isn't the objective drops to nearly nothing. Pain registered as information rather than experience. The heat registered as a problem to solve rather than a thing to endure. She found the XS panel blown off its housing. The main server rack collapsed, 2 of the 3 cooling units destroyed beyond recognition. The primary data core housing was cracked along the seam, and the indicator lights were dead. She had pried it open with a piece of structural rebar, and the 2nd and 3rd fingers of her right hand had touched something she understood, distantly, and with no particular urgency, to be the surface of something that was going to damage them. The Vethkar were at the far end of the corridor when she looked up. She had not heard them come in. She had not heard anything. She had been somewhere else entirely. somewhere that only had room for the access panel and the rebar and the crack in the housing. And, when she surfaced enough to register her surroundings, there they were. 5 of them. In the strange upright locomotion that the tactical briefings always struggled to describe accurately because it was not quite like anything else. Tall, very still. The one at the front with the resonance array at its thorax, which she recognized from the same briefings as the command unit, was looking at her. She looked back. This was, she would think later, the thing that was probably most surprising to it. Not that she was still there. Not that she was still moving. That she looked back. That she met whatever passed for eyes in a Vethkar command unit, and did not look away. Not because she was brave, but because she was entirely focused on something else, and her threat assessment circuit was still tripped. And the Vethkar, whatever it was simply not the priority. She had the data core. She pulled it the rest of the way, free with both hands, and stood up from the crouch, and she was aware, in the distant information way of the state she was in, that her hands were not working exactly right. She held the data core against her chest and looked at Vethkar Commander and waited to see what would happen next. Happened was nothing. For a duration she could not afterwards estimate. The commander was still, and its unit was still, and Mara was still, and the corridor groaned around them with the specific deep note of a structure approaching critical, and nobody moved. Then the sound, lower than language. She had read, in the diplomatic contact reports, that the Vethkar produced infrasonic vocalizations that some researchers had categorized as tactical communication, and others had argued were involuntary. More like an autonomic response than a deliberate signal. Whatever it was, it moved through the smoke and the heat and sat in her chest for a moment, like a word she had almost understood. And then the command unit turned, and the unit followed it, and they were gone. She stood in the burning corridor, with the data core held against her chest. She stood there for what the station's structural sensors later indicated was approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which was how long it took for the secondary collapse warning to break through the state she was in and remind her that she was still present, and the building was not going to remain so. She walked out, the data core. That was the thing about spending your entire adult career in neuromorphic systems. Engineering. You understood at a level most people didn't think about, that a person was not entirely their body. Consciousness was not stored in tissue. It was an architecture, a pattern, a set of dynamic relationships between nodes of information that could, in theory, be mapped and preserved if you had the right tools and the right timing. Lena's neural engram. Her cognitive architecture, the 16 million interaction nodes that constituted how she processed the world, and laughed, and argued, and asked questions, had been captured 48 hours before the attack. Teen Systems Audit Mara had scheduled herself. Routine. That word sat in her chest now, with a specific gravity. Heavier than it should have been, the weight of something that had saved everything without knowing it was doing so. She kept the data core in the lower drawer of the workbench when she wasn't actively using it. She had started keeping it there when, after the 3rd week, when she'd realized she was checking on it every hour, on the hour like a patient who won't admit they're checking vitals, and decided that a small physical barrier between compulsion and action was probably healthy. The workbench itself had accumulated a year of obsession. Diagrams in 3 different marker colors, each color a different theoretical approach she had pursued, and either incorporated or abandoned. Journal abstracts with entire paragraphs, marked and contested in the margins. A whiteboard, covered in the ultimate shorthand of someone working past the edge of the documented field, past the point where references existed, out into the territory where you had to build your own vocabulary, because nobody had been there before. At the top of the whiteboard, barely legible, the insight that had unlocked the whole problem 3 months ago. Active inferencing. Memory is not a recording, it is a construction. Every recall is a resynthesis below that, underlined twice. The brain does not play back. It rebuilds. That had been the key she couldn't turn for 9 months. Stored engrams were not memories in the human sense. They were snapshots, static, dimensionally flattened. They preserved the informational content of an experience, but not the phenomenology, the quality of being inside it. The warmth, the texture, the sense that the world was real and present and inhabited. Playing a stored engram back through standard neuromorphic channels was like being shown a photograph of a room instead of standing in the room. You received information. You did not receive presence. What she had been building for the last year was the bridge between those two things. She pulled the lower drawer open. Inside, sitting in the custom foam cradle she'd printed for 3 months ago, was the apparatus. She'd finished the final calibration on a Tuesday in the early hours of the morning. And then she'd sat looking at it for 3 days before she opened the drawer again. It looked unremarkable. That was one of its better qualities. A lightweight headset, mostly printed polymer, with induction nodes at the temples and the base of the skull. Small and flush, barely visible unless you were looking for them. The nodes trailed optical fiber leads, thinner than fishing line, to a processing unit the size of a thick paperback book. Processing unit contained a modified version of the station's neuromorphic interpreter, stripped back to its foundational architecture and rebuilt from first principles. She had written more code in this room, alone, than she had written in the previous decade combined. She set the apparatus on the bench. Then she opened the comm channel. Toe. The response came after a 3-second delay. He was on the far end of the base. She could tell by the echo and by the slight ambient hum of the recycler units that were louder on that side of the structure. Yeah, Commander? What time is it? Late or early? I finished it. A longer pause. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, in the way that voices change when someone is sitting up suddenly in the dark. The interface. I want you here, before I run the first full session. Fresh eyes on the architecture. Mara, you're not. I need someone who can see the errors I can't. I've been too close for too long. She paused. And I don't want to be alone in the room if something goes wrong. That was the honest answer, more honest than she'd planned. There was a silence that contained a certain quality of decision. 10 minutes, he said. She looked at the photograph while she waited. This was the rule. Once, at the end, after the work. Lena in the habitat garden on level 4, wearing an orange environmental suit that was 3 sizes too big for her, holding a tomato plant with both hands, and regarding it with the expression of someone who has successfully negotiated with the universe and is waiting patiently for the universe to honor the terms. Mara touched the frame and did not say anything. There was nothing to say that was adequate. There was only the apparatus, and the work, and the small luminous architecture in the data core that was not her daughter exactly, but was also, in ways that Mara had given up, trying to argue cleanly, not nothing. Tomas Soto was constitutionally incapable of entering a room without reading every surface in it before he acknowledged the humans present. He came through the door and his eyes went in sequence to the whiteboard, the workbench layout, the apparatus, the display output, the stack of annotated journal papers, the 2 empty coffee cups, and finally to her. He had a flask in his left hand, the old battered aluminum one she'd seen him carry for 6 years on 3 different postings. He set it on the edge of her desk without comment, without ceremony, in the specific way you leave something for someone without making them ask. Show me the architecture, he said. She showed him. It took 40 minutes. She walked him through every layer. The engram extraction protocol and how it interfaced with the data core's storage format. The active inference synthesis layer, which was the critical piece, the thing nobody had built before. An intermediate processor that didn't write the memory signal directly to the user's neural activity, but instead used it as a scaffolding prompt, inviting the brain's own predictive architecture to construct the experience from the inside. The induction feedback loop that allowed real-time calibration between the stored engram and the user's moment-to-moment neural state, so the constructed memory would feel native, rather than imposed. She watched him while she talked. She was looking for the moment he found the flaw she'd missed, the assumption she'd baked in without realizing it. The moment did not come. The synthesis layer, he said finally. If it loses coherence mid-session, hard cut to baseline. The user experiences a sharp discontinuity, disorienting, comparable to waking from a vivid dream mid-cycle, possibly a headache. Not dangerous. How do you know? Because I've run partial sessions. Nothing fully loaded. Short duration trials with a subset of the architecture. The worst outcome was a headache that lasted 40 minutes and a strong sense of temporal displacement. She paused. I need you here. Because if I run a full session and something goes wrong, I don't want it to go wrong while I'm alone. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the second chair up to the workstation. Without any further discussion, sat down and began the pre-check sequence with the calm, methodical competence that was the most reliable thing about him, which was saying something, because everything about him was reliable. She sat down. She connected the leads to the processing unit and confirmed the data core handshake. The display populated with the architecture she'd spent a year building, annotated in her own tight handwriting. She looked at it for a moment. A year's worth of nights looking back at her. She lifted the headset. Pre-check nominal, Soto said. Synthesis layer is initialized. Engram handshake confirmed and stable. He stopped. It was her name, just the one syllable. I know, she said. Mara, start the session. The world did not go dark. She had expected darkness. Some kind of hard visual interrupt that would mark the boundary between states. There wasn't one. There was a softening instead. A perceptual adjustment so gradual she couldn't identify the moment it began, like the difference between a room with the lights on and a room with the lights on, and one window letting in late afternoon sun. A quality of illumination rather than a quantity of it. Something added rather than something taken away. And then the warmth arrived. Not temperature. Not the recycled air warmth of the station, which was always precisely calibrated, and always somehow unconvincing, too even, too managed. Nothing like the warmth of a room where someone has been living, rather than a room that has been maintained. The synthesis layer, built from the engram data, and the architecture of her own memory was the specific atmospheric presence of a room that a person had recently been in. The residual warmth of inhabitation, the quality of air that has been breathed and moved through by someone who had weight and intention, and the sound. Small feet on composite flooring, the specific irregular rhythm of a child in motion at the speed children move when they are following a thought rather than going somewhere. The rhythm that started and paused and started again, that had its own logic and its own momentum, and did not look like anything except what it was. Mara did not close her eyes. She sat at the workbench in the dim station room, Soto beside her, and she did not close her eyes, and she was in two rooms at once. In the cold, precise room, with its equipment and its dust and its flask on the edge of the desk. And in another room, built from stored data and the brain's own insistent capacity for construction, where a 7-year-old was explaining something very rapidly and very seriously about soil bacteria, and whether the ethical calculus of eating something changed, depending on whether it was technically alive. She did not say anything. She sat very still, and she did not say anything. And she listened, and outside the porthole, the rain came down sideways as it always did, and the relay towers stood their ground. When the session ended, it ended gently. No hard cut, no discontinuity. The constructed room dissolved at the edges first, then the center, unhurried, the way morning dissolves a dream you've been holding deliberately. She sat in the station chair and did not move for a while. Soto did not speak, which was the right call, which was one of the many reasons she had asked him to be here. After a while, she reached up and removed the headset carefully. Set it on the bench. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the rain. It works, she said. Yeah, said Soto quietly. Tell. She didn't turn around. She held her hand out, and he passed her the flask, and she took a long drink of whatever it was. Something that tasted like grain and old wood, and all the places the flask had been before, and let the warmth of it move through her, like an argument she had finally won. What's that have to do with the Vethkar? He asked. Because Soto was the kind of person who could wait through an emotional moment, and then ask the question underneath it, which was the other reason she'd wanted him here. She turned from the window. This was the part she hadn't told anyone. Second thing, the thing that had taken the shape of a question, and then the shape of a theory, and then the shape of something she was willing to stake a lot on, growing in parallel with the apparatus work, inseparable from it now. The Vethkar stopped, she said, when they had every tactical advantage, when the facility was burning, and I was alone and injured, and they could have completed the mission in 4 minutes. They stopped. They looked at me, and they left. The prevailing theory is some kind of instinctive. The prevailing theory is wrong. She moved to the whiteboard and uncapped a marker. The Vethkar don't respond to grief. The xenodiplomacy profiles are consistent across 30 years of contact data. Vethkar neural architecture processes emotional states through a strict threat relevance filter. Everything below a certain activation threshold is treated as behaviorally inert. Grief doesn't register. It's noise. She wrote on the whiteboard. Preservation behavior, non-survival context. What the Vethkar saw was not grief. They saw was me digging a data core out of burning rubble with my bare hands when my hands were already burned and the structural integrity was critically compromised, and there was zero strategic reason to do it. Soto was very still. They had just destroyed what they came to destroy. The logical response, the only logical response in any model they have ever built of any species they have ever encountered, is abandonment. Asset destroyed, move on, optimize for the next objective. She tapped the whiteboard, but I wasn't doing that. I was doing the opposite of that. I was acting in complete defiance of the foundational axiom of their predictive model, which is that all species under sufficient existential pressure optimize for survival. She put the cap back on the marker. I was preserving something that had no survival utility, and I was doing it with an urgency and a single-mindedness that looked to them indistinguishable from survival behavior. A behavior that had all the metabolic and motivational signatures of life preservation. The adrenaline, the physical damage tolerance, the refusal to disengage, pointed at something that was, by every measure in their model, already gone. The room was quiet for a long moment. You broke their model, Soto said. I created a data point their model couldn't classify. And the Vethkar are methodical. They don't discard unclassifiable data. They suspend operations until the anomaly is resolved. She turned to face him. So I went back through every documented Vethkar withdrawal in 30 years of contact history. Every case where they had clear tactical advantage and disengaged anyway. Every stop. She paused to let that land. In every single case, there was a human, or a group of humans, doing something that registered as survival behavior urgency, but was directed at a non-survival object. The evacuation of the Ganymede archive during the third incursion, where a team of 6 people carried physical books through an active combat zone. The Meridian Station incident, where the surviving crew spent 4 hours recovering the personal effects of the dead, instead of reinforcing their defensive perimeter. 12 other cases. She looked at him. They've been watching us do this for 30 years, and they cannot figure out what it means. And an enemy that cannot model you is not a conquered enemy. It's a confused one. Soto sat with this for a while. Then he picked up the flask. You're going to propose something to Central Command. I'm going to propose something that might create a conversation where there wasn't one before. That's a careful way to say you're going to do something that will make the military command structure profoundly uncomfortable. Yes, she said. I'm going to do it anyway. The proposal took 4 days to write and 11 days to receive a partial, hedged, bureaucratically non-committal response from Central Command, which she interpreted as permission by omission. The xenodiplomacy team wanted more data. The Military Strategy Division wanted a threat risk assessment. The Ethics Board wanted a discussion about whether what she was proposing was a weapon or a form of communication. She told them it was a mirror. The plan was straightforward in concept and required significant coordination in execution. The Vethkar had been engaged in systematic behavioral cataloging of human populations for 3 decades. Every contact event was a data collection exercise. Every human tactical response, a node in a predictive model. They were building towards some threshold of confidence that would trigger full subjugation. They did this with every species. They were patient and thorough, and their models, as far as could be determined from the intel record, were very good. The catalog had a structural flaw. It was built entirely on survival logic. The Vethkar had never encountered a species that routinely, consistently, urgently invested resources in things that had no survival utility, not as anomalous behavior, not as outliers, but as a fundamental characteristic of how they operated. They had been observing humans for 30 years, and they had 12 anomalous data points they couldn't resolve. 12 stops. 12 moments of Vethkar uncertainty. She was proposing to give them something that couldn't be resolved. Something not anomalous but systematic. Betting. Something that would force the question from the margins of their model to the center of it. She requisitioned 2 transport vessels, a communications relay array, and Soto. She also put out a request across Kepler 9 and 2 neighboring stations for volunteers. She explained the mission in terms that were honest about the risk and also honest about what she thought it could accomplish. Asked each volunteer to bring something. Not equipment, not weapons, something preserved, something that had no tactical value. 17 people said yes. She had expected fewer. She had written the request carefully, trying to be honest about what she didn't know. Whether the vet would respond, whether that they would interpret what she was transmitting as anything other than a provocation, whether showing them something they couldn't classify would create an opening or trigger exactly the elimination response their behavioral models predicted for threats that exceeded catalogable parameters. She had tried to write the uncertainty in plain language and not dress it up as confidence she didn't have. 17 people had read the plain language uncertainty and said yes anyway. She thought about that on the transport. She thought about what it meant that these were people who had, in most cases, already lost something to the Vethkar, who had already paid the cost of proximity to this particular war, and had looked at the uncertain proposition she was offering and decided it was worth it. That was not optimism. Optimism was a particular cognitive move that involved downweighting the probability of negative outcomes. What these 17 people were doing was different. They were choosing, with full awareness of the probabilities, to do the thing anyway. Because the conversation that might exist on the other side of the risk was worth more than the safety of not having it. That was also, she realized, what the apparatus was, what it had always been. Not a solution to grief, not a workaround for loss. You couldn't work around loss. It sat in the floor of everything, and you built around it and above it, and eventually, you learned to navigate the load-bearing walls. But you didn't remove it. The apparatus was a conversation, a way of saying, this existed, and what existed does not stop existing because the body stopped. Here is the architecture of what it was. Here is the specific, particular, irreplaceable pattern of it. I am choosing, with full awareness of all the probabilities, to keep talking. Tomas Soto, who had not been asked, because she'd assumed, received this news with the expression of someone who has been offended that they needed to be asked at all. Among the 17, a geologist named Fry, who had lost his entire survey team in the Kalindra incursion 2 years back, who said yes before she had finished explaining, and who spent the entire transport journey with his headphones in, watching 2 hours of low-resolution footage of 4 geologists arguing about orbital mechanics over tinned food in a makeshift base camp on a planet that no longer had a human presence. His face, during this, was doing the specific quiet work that faces do when they are processing something that simultaneously hurts and sustains you. Mara watched him from across the bay and understood, with complete clarity, that what she was watching was the most human thing she had ever seen. Courage, not ingenuity, not tactical brilliance. The specific, irrational, irreducible fact of a person sitting with something he loved that was gone, refusing to behave as though it was nothing. That was the thing the Vethkar couldn't catalog. The Vethkar detected them 6 hours out from the contact point. The communication relay registered the characteristic frequency, modulation pattern, the diplomatic catalog, coded as extended observation mode. Not attack posture, not withdrawal signal, but the sustained, focused attention of a species allocating significant processing resources to something it was not yet sure how to classify. They were being watched. She opened the broadband emitter and began the transmission. Not language, not a diplomatic message, not a ceasefire request, not anything that could be received as a strategic communication between parties. She transmitted the apparatus's technical architecture. Complete, annotated, the full engineering documentation of the device she had built in a dark room for a year. The schematics and the code, and the synthesis layer design, and the active inference principle at its core. She transmitted the signal logs from the sessions she had run. She transmitted the context, the accident, the year, the burned hands, the data core. Every piece of documentation she had that answered the question the Vethkar had been unable to resolve for 12 contact events across 30 years. She transmitted the answer to Y. The transmission ran for 4 hours. The Vethkar observation signal did not change for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Then Soto said her name very quietly across the command bay. With a quality in his voice she had heard him use exactly twice before, each time in the presence of something he did not have a category for yet. She crossed to his station. On the monitor, the frequency pattern had shifted. Small, almost within the noise floor, but unmistakable once you knew the catalog. It was not any of the 19 documented Vethkar transmission states. It was something new. "What is it?" she said. He had his hands flat on the console. He was listening with his whole body. "I think," he said slowly, with the specific care of someone who knows the weight of what they're about to say, "it might be a question." She stood with that for a moment. Question. The Vethkar, who had been certain for 30 years, were asking a question. The war did not end that day. She had not expected it to. Wars are not architecture. You cannot redesign them and rebuild them overnight. What happened was smaller than an ending and larger than a beginning. The Vethkar paused, withdrew from 3 contested systems without tactical explanation. The diplomatic catalog received a 20th documented transmission state, one that the Xeno-diplomacy team would spend 6 months arguing about, and eventually annotate in careful tentative language as something resembling inquiry. The Vethkar, who had incorporated 47 species in 3 centuries, and never once asked a species anything, had encountered something they needed to understand before they could proceed. And needing to understand something is a very different posture from being certain. Mara was in the habitat garden on level 4 when Soto brought her the confirmation. The tomato plants were still struggling in the imprecise artificial light, not quite thriving. Exactly. But surviving with the particular competence of things that are good at finding what they need in conditions that weren't designed for them. She was doing what she always did when she came to the garden, which was talk. She talked in the low, continuous way. You talk to someone who is present in the ways that count, using the apparatus in her pocket and the data core at her hip and the synthesis layer that built presence out of stored light and the brain's own insistent refusal to accept absence as the final word. Soto sat beside her on the planter edge and read the confirmation on his handheld and passed it to her without preamble, and she read it twice. "What happens next?" she said. He considered this with the unhurried thoroughness he brought to all the important questions. "They keep asking," he said. "We keep answering. First, for somewhere along the line they develop enough of a model to have a real conversation. Or they decide the whole thing is too destabilizing to their operating framework, and they go back to being straightforwardly terrifying. Even if they go back," she said, "they go back knowing something they didn't know before." Which is? She looked at the grow lights. She thought about the Vethkar commander, standing still in the burning corridor, making a sound older than language, looking at a human woman in the wreckage, doing the thing that did not fit the model. She thought about Fry, watching his team eat tinned food and argue about orbital mechanics in a base camp on a dead planet. She thought about Soto setting a flask on the corner of a desk without being asked. That there's something in this part of the galaxy that behaves in ways their model can't predict, she said. That makes them uncertain. That the uncertainty isn't going to resolve the way they expect it to, because the behavior they're trying to catalog isn't an anomaly. It's a pattern. It's what we do. She stood, brushed dust from her knees, and pocketed the apparatus with the care of someone handling something that matters. An uncertain enemy is a different problem than a certain one. I would rather have a different problem. He looked up at her from the planter edge. That's an interesting way to describe winning. I didn't win anything. She moved toward the garden door and stopped with her hand on the frame, and the grow light fell across her face and across the scarring on her right hand and across the small device in her jacket pocket. I showed them something they couldn't explain, she said. That means there's a question, and a question means there's a conversation. And there wasn't a conversation before. She went through the door. Soto sat for a while in the garden after she left. He looked at the tomato plants. He had been thinking for the past hour about a specific moment during the transmission run, when he had looked around the command bay of the transport vessel at the 17 people Mara had brought out here to the exclusion zone. The geologist, the two comms specialists, the medic who had spent the journey transcribing audio messages from a dead colleague's personal recorder, the structural engineer who'd kept a crumpled drawing her son had made the morning of the Vethkar's first contact event, faded to near invisibility but still held. And he had thought, this is what we are. Not the ships, not the defensive perimeters, not the strategic withdrawal models and the contact protocols and the threat assessment frameworks. These specific people in this specific bay doing this specific irrational, irreducible thing. He had also thought, the Vethkar don't have this. He didn't know what the Vethkar had. Exactly, nobody did. The distributed intelligence structure implied something. Not individual experience in any recognizable sense, not memory as a personal archive. The kind of memory you could sit with at 3 in the morning and argue was worth everything you'd paid for it. The Vethkar optimized, they cataloged, they incorporated. They had built an empire across 47 species, and not one of those species had made them pause, the way a single human woman with burned hands in a burning corridor had made them pause. Maybe because none of those species had shown them what it looked like to refuse. Not refuse to die, not refuse to lose. Refuse to let the thing you loved become past tense while you still had hands to act with. The question the Vethkar were transmitting, the 20th state, the new one, the one the Xeno-diplomacy team was going to spend 6 months arguing about. He thought he understood it, even if he couldn't translate it. He thought it was a version of, why do you do that? And the answer was, because we are the species that does that. We carry our dead with us. We sit in transport bays, watching low-resolution footage of people eating tinned food, and we do not do this because it is tactically useful. We do it because the love itself is the thing. The love is not instrumental to something else. It is the point. That was not something you could catalog. That was something you either understood, or you spent 300 years asking the question. The Vethkar, for the first time, were asking the question. That was not nothing. In a very long war, in a very indifferent universe, that was not nothing at all. Behind her, the garden hummed with the sound of imperfect growing things, persistent in conditions that hadn't been designed for them, finding what they needed where they could, the way living things tend to do when they're inclined towards surviving. Somewhere in the outer belt, at the edge of sensor range, a distributed intelligence that had operated with total certainty for 300 years was sitting with a question it could not yet answer, transmitting on a frequency that nobody had a name for yet, doing something that looked, in the delayed readings on Soto's monitor, in the annotated logs, in the careful tentative language of scientists arguing about what they were seeing, unmistakably like listening. The rain came back that evening. It did what it always did, which was arrive sideways and loud and without apology, and hammer the relay towers until the sparks flew, and make everything sound like something that might not hold. The towers held. They had been built by people who understood that things needed to hold. Mara sat at her workbench and placed the headset, and the room softened, and the warmth arrived. Outside the porthole, the storm worked through its violence with the efficiency of something that doesn't mean anything by it. Eventually, the way storms always eventually do, it began to ease. She listened for a long time, thinking about the synthesis layer, the thing she had tried to explain to the Xeno-diplomacy team in a document they had received politely, and she suspected, not fully understood, was that it didn't manufacture, it didn't generate, it invited. The stored engram was a scaffold, and the brain was the builder, which meant that what she experienced in session was not a simulation. It was a construction, made from the real materials of real memory, shaped by the real architecture of a real person's preserved cognitive state. It was in the most precise technical sense she had available, not a copy. It was a continuation. She had written that word in the margin of her own engineering notes 3 months ago, and then looked at it for a long time, and then crossed it out because she didn't know if she was allowed to mean it. She had uncrossed it 2 months later. The Vethkar had no word for continuation in that sense. Their diplomatic catalog, assembled over decades of contact data, contained nothing equivalent. They had words, or whatever the Vethkar frequency state equivalent of words was, for storage, for archive, for record. They had concepts for the preservation of information. What they appeared to have no concept for was the preservation of relationship, the active, ongoing, present-tense relationship between a person and someone who was gone. The conversation that did not end when one party stopped being physically present. That was the 20th transmission state. That was what they were asking about. She sat in the station room with the apparatus and the data core and the photograph at the edge of the desk, and she listened, and somewhere in the outer belt, something that had never been uncertain before, was sitting with a question it didn't have the architecture to answer. And she thought, good, sit with it, let it do its work. She was going to keep listening.